Good morning. I hope I said that right. But it's my first time in Mobile Era Conference and Oslo in general, so I'm very excited to be here. And I also find out that I am one of the speakers that is going to come between you and your lunch today. So I hope I will be able to make the wait less painful. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead. Today I'll be speaking about responsive web development. And a few years ago, my company decided to undergo a redesign in order to unify the design language of our site. And at the same time, they want what everyone wants at the time, which is responsive web. So during responsive web project at Viki, I noticed that there was a lot of time that we could have saved if we had known of the common problems related to responsive web development earlier. So this is what my talk is going to be about today. It is going to be about the mistakes that we did, how we actually solve it, and what you can do in order to avoid it. So a little bit about me before I start. My name is Aysha Anggraini. I work as a front-end engineer at Viki. So I'm actually from Malaysia, but I'm based in Singapore now, so I actually came here from Singapore. It was a 16-hour flight, but not too shabby. So I work at Viki. Viki is a subsidiary company of Rakuten, and Viki is actually a global video streaming site powered by fans, where fans actually can come onto the site and actually subtitle shows, foreign shows on the site. So any one of you ever heard of Korean dramas? Oh, okay, at least 1 and 2. Yeah, we have a lot of those at Viki. So responsive web development workflow is very different from a non-responsive one. And I learned that the hard way. This is because in non-responsive site, you have one site that is supposed to work on different browsers, but it should only work on desktop. But on responsive web, you have different screen sizes and different devices to take into account of. So during the responsive web project at Viki, there are 3 recurring problems that I always encounter. And these 3 problems always centers around how the designers and developers actually work together, how to actually make sure that you're writing maintainable code so that your future self do not curse your past self, and also making sure that you come up with a good testing and debugging strategy to make sure that you come up with a really good product at the end of it all. So most of the time, more often than not, responsive web development will actually force you to change your workflow. And I find that changing that workflow is especially challenging if you are actually revamping a non-responsive site to a responsive one, because chances are you and your team is so used to the non-responsive way of working with things, which brings me to my very first blooper or mistake of the day, which is working together. Initially, me and the designers, the engineers and designers have a lack of collaboration of working together. We have a back and forth way of speaking to one another, and initially this particular communication style works well for us during our pre-responsive era. But when we started applying the same style of communication in our responsive web development, things started to fail. So what do I mean by a back and forth style of communication? So you have a designer and an engineer. The designer will actually give a high fidelity mockup to the engineer. So the engineer will start coding the mockup, realizing it, making it real, and that's when the engineer actually found problems with the design in the first place. So the engineer ended up passing the mockup back to the designer. This is when your designer gets all flustered and frustrated in order to find the solution to that design problem, and this is where sometimes, banters happen as well. And once a design solution is found, the designer will pass back the mock-up to the engineer, the updated mock-up to the engineer. But this is not where the story ends, because obviously, the cycle keeps on repeating itself. The engineer will continue finding problems. And passing back that problem back to the engineer. Now I have 3 reasons why such a communication fail. And the first one is the limitation of the implementation of the design itself. See, your designers, they're very creative people. There are no limits when it comes to their creativity, but there's always going to be limits when it comes to when you start to implement your design. For example, your designer could come up to you with fancy animations, but there's always going to be limitations on how those animations actually render on older browsers and smaller devices. The designer may come up to you with big images, but images there's always going to be limitations on how those images actually affect the performance of your site and the art direction of your site from smaller screen devices to larger screen devices. And finally, a designer may come up to you with beautiful and intricate layouts, but there's always going to be limitations on the difference of expectations between you and the designer. For example, one day my designer come up to me and give me a mock-up. So this is a blueprint of the mock-up. He expects that, okay, so this is in desktop, they expect that the episodes, clips, and trailers should appear as a sidebar. So, okay, as an engineer, when I see the mock-up, I immediately assume that, okay, on a mobile device, it will be, the sidebar will go right under the main content area, because that's how it usually is in responsive web development. But my designer has an entirely different expectation. See, he only expects the clips and trailers to appear right under the main content, while the episode should appear in between the content itself. So this is the example of the difference of expectations that you and your designers may encounter. This is the type of expectations that you should communicate verbally to each other, and you shouldn't just rely on mock-ups alone. Which brings me to my second reason on why such a communication failed for us, which is the mock-ups itself. See, the mock-ups doesn't really tell you what the performance of your site is going to be like. It doesn't really tell you what is the complexity in development that you're going to face. And most importantly, it doesn't really tell you much about the interaction types of your site. I have this beautiful quote by Tom Muslan that I actually plucked from a book by Smashing Magazine. It's called A Real-Life Responsive Web Design. So basically, to summarize, Tom is saying that you can't really assume that the small screen devices interactions type is going to be touch, while the ones in desktop large screen devices is going to be mouse. And you would understand where Tom is coming from if you take an iPad, switch it to landscape mode. Most of the time, it will take the desktop style of design, and depending on your design, you will notice that where your interaction types work seamlessly on desktop, it will start to fail on iPad landscape mode. Now, the third reason, you will always have shortcomings that you discovered late. And because of that, this is when you start thinking about hacks and shortcuts for your code in order to make some compromises, and this is where it's not going to be healthy for your code climate. Or whenever there's last-minute feature that is requested by your users or your product managers, you wouldn't have time to squeeze that in. So just to walk you through to our previous workflow, so see, Viki has a lot of passionate users. The users actually volunteered their time in order to subtitle the foreign shows on the site. So as much as we want the site to be fun for them, we also want it to be easy for them to actually carry out their subtitling tasks. So whenever we undergo redesign, we always ask a few users to test the site out in order to ask their opinions. So, we have a design mocks, and then during the development and testing stages, this is where time is usually lost because of the back and forth communication that we have. And when we give it to the beta testers, if they see a particular feature that they don't like, and when they request it to be changed, we have no time for that. And because of that, when we apply some finishing touch and start to roll it out, the users won't be too happy about it. So an example of a particular feature that our users had requested during that time. So it was cinematic mode. This was during our pre-responsive era. We have the video at the center of a black background, which makes it easier for the users to watch. But once we start to switch to our responsive site, we no longer have that feature. And this is when we roll it out, we had a lot of backlash from the user. The user actually said, oh, it's very demoralizing. It says that the site looks like a hospital, it is too wide, I can't do my subtitles anymore. A lot of first world problems, really. So, but after asking the users more about their opinions, we understand where they're coming from. We understand that they need the cinematic mode because they prefer, it's easier on the eyes, and it's easy for them to multitask across the site. So we know that we cannot go through all of the project by using the same types of communication style anymore. So we decided to discuss a better way of working together. So what does that look like? It's very collaborative, actually. So we have, instead of the designer previously giving the engineer a high fidelity mockup, the designer will give the engineer a low fidelity one instead. And this is when the engineer will start prototyping the mockup, seeing how it works on small screen devices to larger screen devices. And also, based on the prototype, the engineer could start giving feedback to designer in terms of what works and what doesn't. And the designer could start designing within constraints based on the feedback from the engineer. So after the feedback, the designer could actually pass back the high fidelity mockup to the engineer. So when we first test this out, this communication style out, we had a lot of doubt between us because we think that prototyping will actually waste a lot of time. But actually, it's not the case at all because when you are prototyping something, you don't really need to prototype everything. You don't really need to put in colors. You don't really need to think about typefaces. You just want to see how it works, get a feel of it, understand the kind of problems that you can actually find. And the rule when it comes to prototype is to build fast and just build ugly. Now, a better workflow basically is during the design stage, we actually prototype all of the mockups. And during the development and testing stage, I noticed that we have less time lost here. Once we pass it to the beta testers, if there's any feature requests or any changes we need to make, we can always squeeze it in and roll it out. So now, I know that I talked a lot about losing time, and I think one of our worries as engineers is that chasing deadlines. And I think chasing deadline is a bad thing because it could make us really excited to start development earlier. And that excitement caused a lack of planning on development. And when there's a lack of planning on development, there's a possibility for you to increase your technical debt, and you need to refactor those code at some point. And it's possible that when you work with a product company like Viki, you have product development in a quarterly basis to actually squeeze in refactoring time, and that could be pretty overwhelming. So at that time when I was looking at our code, our CSS code, there was an inconsistent ways of writing media queries between the engineers. So in certain components, we have nested media queries, while in another component, it's unnested. And we also have inconsistent paradigm in writing CSS. In certain components, it's mobile first, while on some other file, it's desktop first, which is really odd. Now, looking back, I think the first thing that I would have suggested to my team to do is to actually think about which browsers and device that you're going to support. And I think you can do this easily by looking at the data of your site, see how many users are actually visiting your site through a particular browser. And I think this is very important because you probably want to think about which browsers you want to support early because, for example, does it make sense to actually fix a bug in IE9 when only 0.2% of your user is visiting your site through that browser? Perhaps not. But if your data is telling you otherwise, that you should actually support those old browsers, then you can let your designers know. Your designers can start thinking about designing within constraints earlier. They can start thinking about the fallbacks of those beautiful layouts and animations earlier. And also, you can also start thinking about device-specific issues. When I first started working on responsive web development, me and my team actually look at this repo by Scott.jl called device blocks. It's actually very useful. It lists all of those issues of specific devices that you can look through. It also contains solutions and workaround that you can employ. And also, you also need to think about coding style guides earlier. There's a lot of that. For example, like naming conventions. There's a lot of naming conventions when it comes to CSS. For example, there's OOCSS, BAM, and SMAX. But in my opinion, it doesn't matter which one you go for. I think it's more important for you to sit down with your team members, decide on which coding conventions, naming conventions that you're going to go with, and actually stick with it. Stick with it is very important, and do not just make it up along the way, because then your code will be harder to maintain. You want it to be consistent, because consistency itself is the key to maintainability. Now, sometimes you have engineers that love to nest their CSS. They nest it to 6 or 7 levels, and that's not a very good thing. It's not very performant, and when you need to override those nested classes, it's very rigid. And finally, media queries. Media queries, when it comes to responsive web development, I think it's very important to actually import mobile-first media queries, because you want to actually make sure that it works on smaller screen devices and then enhance it as you go along the way. Now, of course, once you want to maintain those consistencies, you want to maintain those standards that you just set. And I think it's important to start linting your CSS. I use SCSS lint for our code base because we use Sass. And you can either just run it after developing, or you can just integrate it with your IDE, making it even better to use. Now, also, when you first started developing, it is very tempting to start looking at the kind of frameworks that you're going to use, right? There's a lot of CSS frameworks out there. There's Bootstrap, there's Pure CSS, and there's Materialize. But the problem with frameworks is sometimes it's giving you more than you actually need, which only leads to CSS bloats at the end of the day, and you have to refactor those code out. And sometimes some of these frameworks could be very opinionated, and because of that, it has like some sort of rigid styling rules, which makes it harder to override. And most importantly, when it comes to choosing frameworks, I think it's very important to do proper research to it, because there's a high chance that you're going to go with an unsuitable one. And using an unsuitable framework is much more harmful than using no frameworks at all, because you're going to waste a lot of time refactoring those code out and rewriting a lot of UI components, which is not very good. That being said, though, I'm not against frameworks 100%. I think there's very valid reason to use frameworks. I just think that a lot of thoughts that you should put into it before deciding which frameworks you want to go through first. And of course, at some point, you will have a stable code system. It's not just going to be planning all the time. There is going to be a period of maintenance, and this is where you need to start thinking about maintaining the standards you have set previously. And I think having a component style guide is good for that, because it promotes the reuse of the elements that you've just created. So for example, at Viki, we have a style guide where we list all of the components and also the HTML syntax and how to use them. And I really like style guide because it doesn't just promote reuse, it also promotes faster development. Instead of scouring through one of your code, you can just look at the style guide, look at the elements, and actually pluck the HTML code and use it immediately. And the best thing about it is it's actually provide a better onboarding process for new engineers. Say, for example, sometimes when a new engineer joins your team, it will be very tempting for them to start rewriting all of those code because they thought that it didn't exist. But when you give them the style guide, it kind of gives them sort of a menu of what kind of elements you've already created, making it easy for them to just reuse. But one thing that you need to be aware of style guide, it requires a lot of discipline. which me and my team is still struggling with, because sometimes whenever we create new components, we forgot to actually update the style guide, which is not very nice. You want to have a style guide that is continuously updating, and it should be always updated. So you need to make sure that you're disciplined when it comes to this. So in terms of style guide tool, we're using Hologram, and Hologram works well for us for the Rails stack because it allows us to actually document our style guide in the CSS code itself, and then at the end, you just run a command, and then it will generate the style guide for you, making it very easy to maintain. And also another thing about maintenance is you need to always get with the times. This because as technologists, our tools are continuously updating. It's always up to date, and we always need to figure out which one to use that we can actually use to better our code system. So, for example, some of these tools could actually make you reduce a lot of your code. And one of such particular tool that I want to talk about is CSS Grid. So CSS Grid is actually a better layout system right now. And it's definitely better than a lot of the grid system that is currently out there. Definitely simpler. Instead of using row wrappers, you're just using a display property grid, and it'll just work. And since you get to actually manipulate your grid through CSS, it's not affected by your HTML at all. It is not affected by the source order of the HTML, making it easier for you to control what kind of layout organization you want on smaller screen devices to larger screen devices. So let me just walk you through to our current grid system. We have row wrappers. The reason why we have row wrappers right now for our grid system is because we are imitating a grid system. It's not a true grid system, really. Therefore, we need to push and pull the margins in order to imitate a grid system. And because the current way we're doing layout is mostly we float them to the left all the time, that's why we need to clear those floats. And because of all of these requirements where we're imitating the grid, it leads to a very complicated markup. Now, compare it with the grid system. You have a much simpler markup, right? So instead of, you no longer have row wrappers because you no longer need to imitate a grid system. It's already a grid system. And you manipulate your grid through CSS instead of HTML, which leads to a much simpler markup. So for example, the problems that I described earlier, it can be made easy with grid, actually. So I tried to redo it, and this is something that I come up with, and all I need to do is just change the ordering here, and that would actually make it work the way I want to make it work, instead of actually manipulate it through the HTML syntax itself. But what about browser support? Now, I know that as engineers, one of the reasons why we are actually averse to trying out new tools is because we worry about the browser support a lot. But in terms of new features, I would like you to think of it as an enhancement. Not all browsers need to have the same experience, right? So if your user is actually using an older browser, they can get a downgraded experience instead. So I think it's a very cool time to be developing CSS right now. We have a really bunch of amazing features out there that makes our job easier. One of those is feature queries. Feature queries has been out for quite some time now, but I think it has been gaining traction lately because of the new features that we have in CSS. And what is feature queries? You can think of it as an if statement on your CSS in order to check whether your browser is actually supporting a particular CSS feature or not, which is pretty cool. It's like modernizer in your CSS. So basically, how you would use feature queries is very easy. You would write your fallback code first, and then use the support query in order for you to add the code for newer browsers, and include any overrides for the code above if need be. So I created a really cool layout recently with CSS Grid. So it has it looks like a comic, basically. So I created it with CSS Grid and ClipPath, and it should only work with browsers that supports Grid and ClipPath. But you may be wondering, how does this particular layout would look like on older browsers or browsers that don't support ClipPath and CSS Grid? Well, it doesn't look too bad because it's still accessible. I mean, the layout itself is not wrong. It's just a downgraded experience. Like I said, a lot of engineers would think that, hey, with supports query, it means that I have to code my layout twice. Yes, you will only need to code your layout twice if you think about having the same experience for all browsers, but it doesn't need to be that way. You can have a downgraded experience and an awesome experience in new browsers. So if you want to learn more about feature queries, there's an amazing article by Jen Simmons that you can check out. And also, if you want to learn more about Grid, Rachel Andrew is your Wonder Woman in this. You can look at Grid by Example by Rachel Andrew. You can check it out there. It has a lot of amazing examples and also some of the techniques that you can do in order to actually make sure it works on older browsers as well. Now, on to our final blooper of the day, which is testing site. One of the problems that we encountered during our responsive web development project is we started testing late on devices. That was because Viki in itself was initially a non-responsive site. So we never got into the habit of testing on devices earlier. So we ended up relying too much on emulators, and that ended up hurting us. But I think it's very important to start testing on devices earlier because you want to test those interactions immediately on devices. Is scrolling working as expected on mobile devices? Is touch working as expected? Does the drop-down collapse when you click right outside of the drop-down? Things like that. And another important reason why you should test on device early is because certain bugs and quirks only happens on mobile devices. Emulators could not emulate it at all. So for example, we have this funny bug that only happens in Sony Xperia, where when a user visits the video page, users started watching a video, and when the user actually comes out, the site finally zooms straight into the navigation bar. And we didn't catch this earlier because we didn't test on device early, and it ended up, we had to actually, before we deployed it, we actually had to actually find out what is the cause of this bug, and it was a very funny situation. But anyway, so I think also another reason why you should test on device early is because sometimes you do not want your QA engineers to find those trivial bugs which you could have found earlier had you been disciplined enough in testing your site on devices early. So initially, when me and my other engineers, when we were working on the site together, we built all of the UI components, deployed the staging, and once we passed it to our QA team, they found a lot of trivial bugs, which we could have found ourselves. So a better testing workflow that we have now is that we build all of the UI components, connect to the device, and there's a lot of ways where you can connect your local environment to your device easily. This is where we find most of our trivial bugs during this process, and we will repeat it for all of the UI components. And only then we will give it to our QA engineers, and they are happier, basically, because they didn't find those trivial bugs, and because we already fixed them by then. So I know some of you may have non-trivial backends that makes it hard for you to actually connect your local environment to your device, but there's some tools that you can use, such as Local Tunnel and Proxy Local. What it does is it creates a proxy for your local environment and make it available on the internet, which makes it easy for you to access it everywhere. Now, I know that one of the reasons why I hate testing on devices is because it's very annoying. You have to test one by one on the device, but that's only because I did not know about all of the tools that was available to me at that point. So one of the tools that makes it easy for you to test on devices GoSlab, it allows you to test on devices synchronously, which makes it easy for you to test. And it makes it less torturous. And there's also another tool called Browser Sync as well, which is similar to GoSlab. So you can check that out too. Now, when it comes to maintainability, you want to make sure that the code that you write in the future and on the present will not break your past code. The problem with CSS is it is very easy to break, but it's very hard to test. So the only way to test that is by deploying some sort of visual regression tool. So at Viki, we use Phantom CSS in order to test our site. What Phantom CSS does is it actually takes 2 screenshots of your site and actually compare it with one another. Say, for example, you can take a production version of your site and also your local environment and compare it with each other. What I like about Phantom CSS is it actually sort your screenshot based on your screen sizes. And on the rightmost side, we have my local environment. And on the center, we have the production environment. And based on that difference, there's a difference where the production environment was not showing any ads. So it shows about 3% difference. But it's not considered as an error because the difference is not major. However, the cool thing about Phantom CSS is you can actually control the sensitivity of your tests. In our case, the sensitivity is about 20%. So when there's 20% of difference, it will spit out an error instead. In this case, my local environment is not showing any UI element at all, while my production environment is showing something. Therefore, it will consider that as an error. Now, but there's some kind of drawbacks that you need to look into when you're using Phantom CSS. It doesn't work well with lazy loaded content, and the reason is it's possible that when the test is running, that your content is not yet loaded at the time. And also there's a lot of false positive when it's showing as an error when it's not an error because there's a difference in data. And also it can be quite slow. But for all drawbacks, there's always going to be workarounds. When it comes to lazy loading content, what we did to make it easy for us is we increased the timeouts for running the test to make sure that all of the lazy content has been loaded. And another thing that we did recently was to actually make sure that it's not lazy loaded in our test environment so that we don't need to increase the timeout, making the test even slow. There's also, in order to actually combat false positive, you can make sure that your testing environment has a consistent data with your local environment. So if you're testing a screenshot from your local environment against a testing environment, the data is always going to be the same. So in terms of slow, you don't need to actually test everything. In our case, we only test about 2 or 3, actually 3 pages that contains most of our UI elements. And based on that, we didn't test all our pages. We just test the most important pages. And that actually speeds things up even more. So that's all for the mistakes today. But I want to talk a little bit about our current project, which we've been doing for the past month, which is basically optimizing the site. As I said before, Viki is not originally a responsive site. It was a non-responsive one. So we never really care about how fast it is on mobile. So prior to the performance exercise that we did, where our site works well on desktop, the start render is pretty low, about 2.8 seconds. But of course, the fully load and content is big because Viki itself is very image heavy. But on mobile, it's very not impressive prior to the performance improvement made. Because on mobile, the start render is about 13.8 seconds. No users actually want to visit your site. Even after 2 seconds, you probably just bounce. You just don't care anymore. So we need to do something about that to make sure that the first impression is good enough. And what we did is we make sure that we started to differ all of the scripts by lazy loading it in order to improve the start render of our site. So basically, we started with our fonts first. Initially with fonts, what we did was we just put on the Google Fonts style tag, which is not the best way to do things because it's render blocking. So we make sure that we defer it by actually using the font face, and then we load the fonts dynamically. And when you're using this particular technique, there's always going to be a flash of unstyled text when users visit your site for the first time. But if you actually leverage your browser's cache, this particular effect only happened during the first visit. It won't happen for the repeated visit. So if you're interested to learn more about the web font loading patterns that we did at Viki, you can look at this article by Bram Stein called Web Font Loading Patterns. Bram Stein actually also wrote the particular library that we use in order to load our fonts dynamically. It's called Font Face Observer. There's also a very good article called Comprehensive Guide to Font Loading Strategy by Zach Liederman that I think everyone should check out when it comes to font loading. And of course, you can always, like I said, you need to always get with the times. You can check out the CSS font display. This is a new descriptor for font face. What it does is it actually allows you to control how your font is displayed based on whether or when the font has loaded or not, giving you as engineer much more control. You can either, there are several things that you can do with font display, actually. You can check out the article. It's actually pretty interesting. Now, in terms of differing scripts, we actually go with asynchronous. Async and differ is actually a browser hint for the script tag. So for asynchronous, we use it for scripts that have no dependencies at all, while for differ, it's for scripts with dependencies, and when your execution order of your script matters. So, but the problem with differ is that if you're supporting IE 10 and below, I think there is a bug where the script was not executed in order. So you just need to be aware of that. But if that's the case, you're supporting older browsers like this, you can think about combining those scripts and maybe asynchronously loading that script instead. That's one way you can do things. So after we did some of these performance improvement, we actually used a tool called Speed Curve in order to monitor the performance of our site in different devices and also different networks. And we were pretty surprised with the particular speed improvements that happened. So for example, on our video page, after differing the scripts, we noticed that it was 64% faster, where before it was about 13.8 seconds, now it's about 4.9 seconds. Now, I know that this number is not that impressive, but I know that we can also reduce it even more to at least 2 seconds if we had deferred the CSS as well. I know Majid mentioned as well before, the talk before this about critical CSS. We didn't do that yet because it's kind of complicated, but we're planning to do that soon. Or we probably don't need to do it at all because we're exploring ways on how we can actually think about performance on the network level, such as employing HTTP2, for example, making sure that you don't even need to render critical CSS anymore. And of course, Viki is a very image-heavy site. So we thought about, we decided to use responsive image tag responsibly. Now, I know that this will be very tempting to use, where you have a responsive image class, and you're just controlling the width to make sure that everything is behaving responsively. But don't do this. This is cheating. You're giving the entire larger image to your users. They're still downloading those large images. You're just controlling the sizes. Now, responsive image tag, I have to admit, it's still a bit complicated to use, but it's definitely, the payoff is definitely great. But this is just one example of responsive image tags. This is the fluid width example. And there's 2 more examples, such as the fixed width example and also the art direction example. If you want to learn more about it, I suggest The Anatomy of Responsive Images by Jake Archibald. He has a really good explanation on each of these image tags and what does it do. And of course, when it comes to images, we decided recently that it's much more prudent for us if we lazy load the image. See, based on our data, we noticed that our users only scroll up to 34% of the site. They didn't even scroll all the way. So it was not important to even load those images at the bottom. So we decided to just load the image when the user needs it. So we use lazy sizes. And what's cool about lazy sizes is it actually used the new intersection observer API. Anyone heard of that API before? Intersection observer? Yeah, it's a pretty cool one. So which will actually help you detect whether your particular element is already on a viewport or not. And once we actually lazy load our image, we actually monitor the content requests on our mobile devices. And we notice that it's about 65% lower. And the user doesn't need to, the user doesn't need to actually spend all of those data to actually download all of your image, which is pretty neat. And the speed improvement for fully loaded improves as well for about 40%. And we're pretty happy about that as well. See, we know we can take this further. There's recently an article by, not really an article, but more of a guide by Eddie Osmani called Essential Image Optimization that he released recently. So I haven't actually looked into it yet, but it's going to be a required reading for images. So in terms of performance, one of the tools that we use is Google Lighthouse. Google Lighthouse also gives you some sort of a breakdown on the kinds of images that you should be lazy loading, which is a pretty neat feature. Now, there's a lot of things that we can still do when it comes to performance at Viki, and we've only started doing performance for the past 1 month. That is because we were too busy with product development, and only recently we decided to actually spend some time on optimizing the site. We can think about network level optimization, such as employing HTTP2. Viki is not yet on HTTP2 because we're on the Rails stack, and from my understanding that it's based on Rack, and it hasn't yet supported HTTP2. And of course, there's progressive web app techniques and offline first that we can always explore, and thinking about splitting our JavaScript and lazy loading those when user needs it. So that's all I have for you today. I mean, there's a lot of work that we still need to do, but thank you so much for your attention today. If you have any questions, you can ask me now, or I'm going to be available around lunch. I'll be very happy to entertain your questions. Thank you so much. How do you say thank you in Norwegian?